Part 1 Remittance 1912 Chapter 1 Edwin Street, John Street. Andrew 18 years old. Hauling the weight of his double-sainted name across the Atlantic by steamship, eyes narrowed against the wind. On the upper deck he holds the railing with gloved hands, impatient for a glimpse of the unknown, trying to discern something. Anything beyond sea and sky, but all he sees are shades of endless grey. He is on his way to a different world. He is more or less at the halfway point between England and Canada. I have been sent into exile, he tells himself, and he knows he's being melodramatic, but nonetheless there's a ring of truth to it. Edwin's ancestors include William the Conqueror. When Edwin's grandfather dies, his father will become an earl, and Edwin went to two of the best schools in the country. But there was never much of a future for him back in England. There are very few professions that a gentleman can take up, and none of them are of interest to Edwin. The family estate is destined to go to his oldest brother Gilbert, so he stands to inherit nothing. The middle brother Niall is in Australia already. Edwin might have clung to England a little longer, but he holds secretly radical views which emerged unexpectedly at a dinner party, thus speeding up his fate. In a flash of wild optimism, Edwin has his occupation recorded as farmer on the ship's manifest. It occurs to him later in a contemplative moment out on deck that he's never so much as touched a spade. Part 1 Remittance 1912 Chapter 2 In Halifax he finds lodging by the Porter boarding house, where he is able to secure a corner room on the second floor overlooking the harbour. He wakes that first morning to a wonderfully lively scene outside his window. A large merchant ship has arrived, and he is close enough to hear the jovial curses of the men unloading barrels and sacks and crates. He spends much of that first day gazing out the window like a cat. He planned to go west immediately, but it's so easy to linger in Halifax, where he falls prey to a personal weakness he's been aware of all his life. Edwin is capable of action but prone to inertia. He likes sitting by his window. There's a constant movement of people and ships he doesn't want to leave, so he stays. "Oh, just trying to puzzle out my next move, I suppose," he says to the proprietor when she makes gentle inquiries. Her name is Mrs. Donnelly. She's from Newfoundland. Her accent confounds him. She sounds like she's from Bristol and also from Ireland simultaneously, but then sometimes he hears Scotland. The rooms are clean and she's an excellent cook. Sailors pass by his window in jostling waves. They rarely look up. He enjoys watching them, but dares not make any movement toward them. Besides, they have each other. When drunk, they put their arms around one another's shoulders, and he feels a piercing envy. Could he go to sea? Of course not. He discards the idea as soon as it arises. He once heard of a remittance man who reinvented himself as a sailor, but Edwin's a man of leisure through and through. He loves watching the boats come in, steamships pulling into the harbour with an aura of Europe still clinging to their decks. He takes walks in the mornings and again in the afternoons. Down to the harbour, out to quiet residential areas, in and out of little shops under the striped awnings on Barrington Street. He likes to ride the electric streetcar to the end of the line and then come back, watching the shift from small houses to larger houses to the commercial buildings downtown. He likes buying things that he doesn't especially need: a loaf of bread, a postcard, or a bouquet of flowers. This could be a life. He finds himself thinking it could be as simple as this. No family, no job, just a few simple pleasures and clean sheets to fall into at the end of the day, a regular allowance from home. A life of solitude could be a very pleasant thing. He begins buying flowers every few days, which he places on his dresser in a cheap vase. He spends a long time gazing at them. He wishes he were an artist to draw them, and in so could he learn to draw. He has time and money. It's as good an idea as any. He makes inquiries with Mrs. Donnelly, who makes inquiries with a friend, and a short time later Edwin is in the parlour of a woman who trained as a painter. He spends quiet hours sketching flowers and vases, learning the fundamentals of shading and proportion. The woman's name is Letitia Russell. She wears a wedding ring, but the location of her husband is unclear. She lives in a tidy wooden house with 3 children, and a widowed sister, and an oppressive chaperone who knits endless scarves in a corner of the room so that for the rest of his life, Edwin associates drawing with the clicking of knitting needles. He's been living at the boarding house for 6 months. When Reginald arrives, Reginald, he can tell at once, is not prone to inertia. Reginald has immediate plans to go west. He's 2 years older than Edwin, a fellow old Etonian, third son of a viscount, and his eyes are beautiful, a deep greyish blue. Like Edwin, his plans involve establishing himself as a gentleman farmer, but unlike Edwin, he's actually taken steps to achieve this and has been corresponding with a man who wishes to sell a farm in Saskatchewan. 6 months, Reginald repeats at breakfast, not quite believing it. He stops spreading jam on his toast for a moment, seemingly unsure if he heard correctly. 6 months, Saskatchewan, 6, Edwin says lightly. 6 very agreeable months, I might add. He tries to catch Mrs. Donnelly's eye, but she's focusing intently on pouring tea. She thinks he's a little touched, he can tell. Interesting. Reginald spreads jam on his toast. I don't suppose we're hoping to be called home. Are we clinging to the edge of the Atlantic, staying as close as we can to king and country? This stings a little. So when Reginald lights out for the west the following week, Edwin accepts an invitation to join him. There's pleasure in action, he decides, as the train leaves the city. They've booked first-class passage on a delightful train that features an onboard post office and barber shop where Edwin writes a postcard to Gilbert and enjoys a hot shave and a haircut while watching the forests and lakes and small towns slip past the windows. When the train stops at Ottawa, he doesn't disembark, just stays on board sketching the lines of the station. The forests and lakes and small towns subside into plains. The prairies are initially interesting, then tedious, then unsettling. There's too much of them, that's the problem. The scale is wrong. The train crawls like a millipede through endless grass. He can see from horizon to horizon. He feels terribly overexposed. This is the life, Reginald says, when at last they arrive, standing in the doorway of his new farmhouse. The farm is a few miles outside Prince Albert. It is a sea of mud. Reginald purchased it sight unseen from a disconsolate Englishman in his late 20s, another remittance man Edwin can't help but suspect, who's thoroughly failed to make a go of it here and is headed back east to take a desk job in Ottawa. Reginald is very carefully not thinking about this man. Edwin can see that. Can a house be haunted by failure? When Edwin steps through the door of the farmhouse, he feels immediately ill at ease, so he lingers out on the front porch. It's a well-built house. The previous owner was well-funded once, but the place is unhappy in a way that Edwin can't entirely explain. There's a lot of sky here, isn't there? Edwin ventures, and a lot of mud. Really an astonishing amount of mud. It glitters under the sun as far as he can see, just wide open spaces and fresh air, Reginald says, gazing out at the horrifically featureless horizon. Edwin can see another farmhouse far away, hazy with distance. The sky is aggressively blue. That night they dine on buttered eggs, the only thing Reginald knows how to cook, and salt pork. Reginald seems subdued. I suppose it's quite hard work farming, he says after a while. Physically taxing, I suppose. So when Edwin imagined himself in the new world, he always saw himself in his own farm, a verdant landscape of some unspecified crop, tidy but also vast. But in truth, he never thought much about what the work of farming might actually entail. Taking care of horses, he supposes. Doing a bit of gardening, digging up fields, but then what do you actually do with the fields once you've dug them up? What are you digging for? He feels himself teetering on the edge of an abyss. Reginald, my old friend, he says, what does a fellow have to do to get a drink around here? You reap, Edwin says to himself on his third glass. That's the word for it. You dig up the fields, you sow things in the fields, then you reap. He sips his drink. You reap what? Reginald has a pleasant way about him when he's drunk, as if nothing could possibly offend him. He's been leaning back in his chair, smiling into the empty air. Well, that's just it, isn't it? Edwin says, and pours himself another glass. Part 1 Remittance 1912 Chapter 3 After a month of drinking, Edwin leaves Reginald on his new farm and continues west to meet up with his brother Niall's school friend Thomas, who entered the continent via New York City and sped west immediately. The train through the Rocky Mountains takes Edwin's breath away. He presses his forehead to the window like a child and openly gapes. The beauty is overwhelming. He maybe took the drinking a little far back in Saskatchewan. He'll be a better man in British Columbia, he decides. The sunlight hurts his eyes after all that wild splendor. It's an ordeal to find himself in Victoria in those tamed and pretty streets. There are Englishmen everywhere he steps out of the train, and the accents of his homeland surround him. He could stay here for a while, he thinks. Edwin finds Thomas in a tidy little hotel in the city center where Thomas has taken the best room, and they order tea with scones in the restaurant downstairs. They haven't seen one another in 3 or 4 years, but Thomas has changed very little. He has the same reddish complexion he's had since childhood, that perpetual impression of just having stepped in off the rugby pitch. He's trying to become a member of the Victoria business community, but he's vague on what kind of business he wants to be in. "And how's your brother?" Thomas asks, changing the subject. He means Niall making a go of it in Australia. Edwin says he seems happy enough, judging by his letters. "Well, that's more than most of us can say," Thomas says. "No small thing, happiness. What's he doing down there, drinking away his remittance money, I'd imagine," Edwin says, which is ungentlemanly but also the probable truth. They have a table by the window, and his gaze keeps drifting to the street, the shop fronts, and visible in the distance the unfathomable wilderness, dark towering trees crowding in around the periphery. There's something ludicrous about the idea that the wilderness belongs to Britain, but he quickly suppresses this thought because it reminds him of his last dinner party in England. Part 1 Remittance 1912 Chapter 4 For the last dinner party began smoothly enough. But trouble started when the conversation turned, as ever and always, to the unimaginable splendor of the Raj. Edwin's parents were born in India, Raj babies, English children raised by Indian nannies. "If I hear one more word about her goddamned Aya," Edwin's brother Gilbert muttered once, never finishing the thought, and raised on tales of an unseen Britain that Edwin couldn't help but suspect had been slightly disappointing. When they first laid eyes on it in their early 20s, "More rain than I'd expected," was all Edwin's father would say on the matter. There was another family at that last dinner party, the Burretts, of similar profile. John Burrett had been a commander in the Royal Navy, and Clara, his wife, had also spent her first few years in India. Their eldest son Andrew was with them. The Burretts knew that British India was an inevitable detour in any evening spent with Edwin's mother, and as old friends they understood that once Abigail got the Raj out of her system, conversation could move on. "You know, I so often find myself thinking of the beauty of British India," his mother said. "The colors were remarkable, the heat was rather oppressive though," Edwin's father said. "That's one thing I didn't miss once we came here. Oh, I never found it terribly oppressive." Edwin's mother had a far-off look that Edwin and his brothers called her British India expression. There was a haziness about her that meant she was no longer with them. She was riding an elephant, or strolling through a garden of verdant tropical flowers, or being served cucumber sandwiches by her goddamned Aya, or something, who knows. "Nor did the natives," Gilbert said mildly, "but I suppose that climate's not for everyone." What inspired Edwin to speak just then he found himself dwelling on the matter years later, at war in the terminal horror and boredom of the trenches. Sometimes you don't know you're going to throw a grenade until you've already pulled the pin. Evidence suggests they feel rather more oppressed by the British than by the heat, Edwin said. He glanced at his father, but his father seemed to have frozen his glass halfway between the table and his lips. "Darling," said his mother, "whatever can you mean they don't want us there?" Edwin said. He glanced around the table at all the silent, staring faces. Not a great deal of ambiguity on that point, I'm afraid. He listened to his own voice as if from some distance away with wonderment. Gilbert's mouth had fallen open. Young man, his father said, we have brought nothing but civilization to these people, and yet one can't help but notice. Edwin said that on balance they rather seem to prefer their own. Their own civilization, that is. They managed quite well without us for some time, didn't they? Several thousand years, wasn't it? It was like being strapped to the roof of a runaway train. He actually knew very little about India, but he remembered having been shocked as a boy by accounts of the 1857 rebellion. Does anyone want us anywhere? He heard himself ask. Why do we assume these far-flung places are ours? Because we won them, Eddie Gilbert said after a brief silence. One assumes that the natives of England were perhaps not unanimously delighted by the arrival of our 22nd great-grandfather, but well, history belongs to the victors. William the Conqueror was 1,000 years ago, but surely we might strive to be somewhat more civilized than the maniacal grandson of a Viking raider. Edwin stopped talking then. Everyone at the table was staring at him. The maniacal grandson of a Viking raider, Gilbert repeated softly. Although one should be grateful, I suppose, that we're a Christian nation, Edwin said. Imagine what a bloodbath the colonies would be if we weren't. Are you an atheist? Edwin Andrew Barrett inquired with genuine interest. I don't quite know what I am, Edwin said. The silence that followed was possibly the most excruciating of Edwin's life, but then his father began speaking very quietly. When Edwin's father was furious, he had a trick of beginning speeches with a half sentence to catch everyone's attention. Every advantage you've ever had in this life, his father said. Everyone looked at him. He began again in trademark fashion, only slightly louder, and with deadly calm. Every advantage you've ever had in this life, Edwin, has derived in some manner or another from the fact of your being descended from, as you so eloquently put it, the maniacal grandson of a Viking raider. Of course, Edwin said. It could be so much worse. He raised his glass to William the Bastard. Gilbert laughed in a nervous way. No one else made a sound. I do beg your pardon, Edwin's father said to their guests. One might reasonably mistake my youngest son for a grown man, but it seems he's still a child. To your room, Edwin. We've heard quite enough for one evening. Edwin rose from the table with great formality, said good night. Everyone went to the kitchen to request that a sandwich be delivered to his room. The main course hadn't yet been served, and then retired to await his sentence. It came before midnight with a knock on the door. Come in, he said. He'd been standing by the window staring fretfully out at the movements of a tree in the wind. Gilbert came in, closed the door behind him, and sprawled into the ancient stained armchair that was among Edwin's most treasured possessions. Quite the performance, Eddie. I don't know what I was thinking, said Edwin. Actually, no, that's not true. I do know. I am absolutely certain there was not a single thought in my head. It was like a kind of void. Are you unwell? Not at all. Never better. It must have been rather thrilling, Gilbert said. It was actually. I won't say I regret it. Gilbert smiled. You're to go to Canada, he said gently. Father's making arrangements. I was always going to go to Canada, Edwin said. It's planned for next year now. You're to go a little sooner. How much sooner? Bert? Next week, Edwin nodded. He felt a touch of vertigo. There had been a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. He was going to go forth into an incomprehensible world, and the room was already receding into the past. Well, Edwin said after a moment, at least I'll still be on a different continent to Nile. You're at it again, Gilbert said. Do you just say whatever comes into your head now? I recommend it. We can't all be so careless, you know. Some of us have responsibilities, by which you mean a title and an estate to inherit, Edwin said. What a terrible fate. I'll weep for you later. Will I receive the same remittance as Niall? A little more. Niall's is just meant to support him. Yours comes with conditions. Tell me you're not to come back to England for a while, Gilbert said. Exile, Edwin said. Oh, don't be melodramatic. You were always going to go off to Canada, as you said. But how long's a while? Edwin turned away from the window to stare at his brother. I thought I could go to Canada for a time, establish myself somehow, and then come home at regular intervals for visits. What did father say exactly? I'm afraid the phrase that sticks in memory is tell him he's to stay the hell out of England. Well, that's rather unambiguous, you know how father is. And of course mother is going along with it. Gilbert stood and paused for a moment by the door. Just give them time, Eddie. I'd be astonished if your exile were permanent. I'll work on them. Part 1 Remittance 1912 Chapter 5 The trouble with Victoria in Edwin's eyes is that it's too much like England without actually being England. It's a far distant simulation of England, a watercolor superimposed unconvincingly on the landscape. On Edwin's second night in the city, Thomas takes him to the Union Club. It's enjoyable at first, a shot of home, pleasant hours slipping past in the company of a few other old boys from the homeland and some truly exceptional single malt scotch. Some of the older men have been in Victoria for decades and Thomas seeks out their company. He stays close, asks their opinions, listens seriously to them, flatters them. It's embarrassing to watch. Thomas is clearly hoping to establish himself as a steady kind of man with whom one might wish to go into business, but it's obvious to Edwin that the older men are only being polite. They're not interested in outsiders, even outsiders from the correct country with the correct ancestors and the correct accent who have gone to the correct school. It's a closed society that admits Thomas only on the periphery. How long will Thomas have to stay here circling around inside this clubhouse before they'll accept him? 5 years, 10, a millennium. Edwin turns his back on Thomas and goes to the window. They're on the third floor with a view of the harbor and the last light is fading from the sky. He feels restless and ill at ease. Behind him, men are relating tales of sporting triumphs and uneventful voyages by steamship to Quebec City, Halifax, and New York. Would you believe an arrival at the latter port is saying somewhere behind him, my poor mother was under the impression that New York was still part of the Commonwealth. Time passes, night falls over the harbor. Edwin rejoins the other men, but the unfortunate truth of the matter, one says in the depths of a conversation about the importance of being an adventuring sort, is we've no real future back in England, have we? A pensive silence falls over the group. These men are second sons, one and all. They are ill-prepared for a working life and will inherit nothing. To his own great surprise, Edwin raises a glass to exile, he says, and drinks. There are disapproving murmurs. I would hardly call this exile, someone says. To building a new future, gentlemen, in a new and far distant land, says Thomas, ever the diplomat. Later, Thomas finds him standing by the window. You know, he says, I may have heard something or other in passing about a dinner party, but I'm not sure I quite believed it till now. I'm afraid the Barretts are incorrigible gossips. I think I've had about enough of this place, Thomas says. I thought I could make a go of it here, but if you're going to leave England, surely there's something to be said for actually leaving England. He turns to face Edwin. I've been thinking about going north. How far north? Edwin is beset by a worrisome vision of igloos on the frozen tundra. Not very far, just up Vancouver Island a little. You have prospects there, specifically my friend's uncle's timber company, Thomas says. But in the abstract, wilderness, isn't that why we're here, to leave a mark on wilderness? What if one wanted to disappear into wilderness instead? A strange thought on a northbound boat a week later, steaming up the broken coast of the west side of Vancouver's island. A landscape of sharp beaches and forest mountains rising up behind. Then all at once the broken rocks subside into a white sand beach, the longest Edwin has ever seen. He sees villages on the shore, smoke rising, those wooden columns with wings and painted faces, totem poles he remembers now erected here and there. He doesn't understand them and therefore finds them menacing. After a long time, the white sand subsides into rocky crags and narrow inlets again. Every so often he sees a canoe in the distance. What if one were to dissolve into the wilderness like salt into water? He wants to go home for the first time. Edwin begins to worry about his sanity. The passengers on the boat, 3 Chinese men going to work in the cannery, a very tense young woman of Norwegian origin traveling to join her husband Thomas, and Edwin the captain, and 2 Canadian crewmen, all in the company of barrels and sacks of supplies. The Chinese men talk and laugh in their own language. The Norwegian woman stays in her cabin except for meals and never smiles. The captain and crew are cordial but uninterested in talking to Thomas and Edwin, so Thomas and Edwin spend most of their time together up on deck. What those utterly inert fellows in Victoria don't quite understand, Thomas says, is that the entirety of this land is here for the taking. Edwin glances at him and sees into the future. Since Thomas was rejected by the Victoria business community, he'll spend the rest of his life railing against them. They're ensconced in their very English city, and look, I do understand the appeal, but we have an opportunity here. We can create our own world in this place. He drones on about empire and opportunity while Edwin gazes out over the water. The inlets and coves and little islands are on their starboard side, and just beyond them rises the immensity of Vancouver Island, its forests ascending into mountains whose summits are lost in low cloud. On the port side where they're standing, the ocean extends uninterrupted until, as far as Edwin can figure it, the coast of Japan. He has the same queasy sense of overexposure that he felt on the prairies. It's a relief when the boat finally makes a slow right turn and begins traveling up an inlet. They reach the settlement of Kate in the early evening. There isn't much to it appear: a small white church, 7 or 8 houses, a rudimentary road that leads up to the cannery, and the logging camp. Edwin stands by the pier with his steamer trunk beside him, at a loss. This place is precarious, that's the only word for it. It's the lightest sketch of civilizations caught between the forest and the sea. He doesn't belong here. That bigger building up there's a boarding house, the captain says kindly to Edwin. If you wanted to stay here for a spell, get your bearings. It's troubling to realize he's so obviously lost. Thomas and Edwin walk up the hill together to the boarding house and secure rooms on the upper floor. In the morning, Thomas departs for the logging camp while Edwin slips immediately into the same stasis that overcame him in Halifax. It isn't quite listlessness. He makes a careful inventory of his thoughts and decides that he isn't unhappy. He just desires no further movement for the time being. If there's pleasure in action, there's peace in stillness. He spends his days walking on the beach, sketching, contemplating the sea from the porch, reading, playing chess with other boarders. After a week or two, Thomas gives up trying to persuade him to come to the logging camp. Edwin is astonished by the beauty of this place. He likes to sit on the beach and just gaze out at the island's little tufts of trees rising out of the water. Canoes pass by sometimes on unknowable errands, and the men and women in the boats sometimes ignore him and sometimes stare. Larger boats come in at regular intervals, bringing men and supplies for the cannery and the camp. Some of them know how to play chess, which is one of Edwin's great pleasures. He's never been very good at chess, but he enjoys the sense of order in the game. What are you doing here? They sometimes ask. Oh, just contemplating my next move, I suppose, he always replies, or words to that effect. He has a sense of waiting for something, but what? Part 1, Remittance, 1912, Chapter 6. On a sunny morning in September, he's out for a walk when he comes upon 2 indigenous women laughing on the beach. Sisters, good friends, they speak in a rapid language unlike anything he's ever heard, a language punctuated by sounds he can't imagine being able to replicate, let alone render in the Roman alphabet. Their hair is long and dark, and when one of them turns her head, light glances off a pair of enormous shell earrings. The women are wrapped in blankets against a cold wind. They fall silent and watch him as he approaches. Good morning, he says, and touches the brim of his hat. Good morning, one replies. Her accent has a beautiful lilt. Her earrings hold all the colors of the dawn sky. Her companion, whose face bears a scattering of smallpox scars, just looks at him and says nothing. This isn't out of keeping with Edwin's experience of Canada. If anything, he reflects, it would come as the shock of his life if after half a year in the New World he were to find himself suddenly able to charm the locals, but the flat uninterest of the woman's gaze is unnerving. This is a moment he realizes when he could express his views on colonization to people on the other side of the equation, so to speak, but he can't think of anything to say that doesn't sound absurd under the circumstances. If he tells them he believes colonization to be abhorrent, surely the logical next question will be, then what are you doing here? So he says nothing further, and then they're behind him, and the moment has passed. He keeps walking, and then at some distance, still feeling their eyes on his back, and wishing to convey an impression of having some sort of important errand to attend to, he turns toward the wall of trees. He never goes into the forest because he's afraid of bears and cougars, but now it holds a strange appeal. He'll step in 100 paces, he decides. No more counting off 100 paces might calm him. Counting has always calmed him, and if he walks straight for the full 100, then surely he can't get lost. Getting lost is death. He can see that. No, this whole place is death. No, that's unfair. This place isn't death. This place is indifference. This place is utterly neutral on the question of whether he lives or dies. It doesn't care about his last name or where he went to school. It hasn't even noticed him. He feels somewhat deranged. Part 1, Remittance, 1912, Chapter 7 to 9, The Gates of the Forest. The phrase comes immediately to mind, but Edwin's not sure where he picked it up. It sounds like something from a book he might have read as a boy. The trees here are old and enormous. It's like stepping into a cathedral, except the underbrush is so thick that he has to fight his way through. He stops a few paces and he sees a maple tree just ahead, large enough that it's created its own clearing, and that seems like a pleasant destination. He'll walk to the maple tree. He decides he'll step out of the underbrush and linger a moment, then he'll go back to the beach immediately and never enter the forest again. This is an adventure, he tells himself, but it doesn't feel like an adventure. Mostly it feels like being slapped in the face with salal branches. He fights his way through to the maple. It's quiet here, and he has a sudden certainty that he's being watched. He turns, and there, as incongruous as an apparition, is a priest standing no more than a dozen yards away. He's older than Edwin, perhaps in his early 30s, and has very short black hair. "Good morning," Edwin says. "Good morning," the priest says, "and forgive me, I didn't mean to startle you. I like to walk here on occasion." There's something about his accent that eludes Edwin. It's not quite British, but not quite anything else. He wonders if the man's from Newfoundland, like his landlady back in Halifax. It does seem a peaceful destination, Edwin says. "Quite so. I won't intrude on your contemplation. I was just on my way back to the church." "Perhaps you'll stop in later. The church at Kate, but you're not the usual priest," Edwin says. "I'm Roberts. Filling in for Father Pike, Edwin St. Andrew. Pleased to meet you. Likewise. Good day." The priest seems no more practiced at walking through underbrush than Edwin. He crashes away between the trees, and within minutes Edwin is alone again, gazing up at the branches. He steps forward into a flash of darkness, like sudden blindness or an eclipse. He has an impression of being in some vast interior, something like a train station or a cathedral, and there are notes of violin music. There are other people around him, and then an incomprehensible sound. When he returns to his senses, he's on the beach, kneeling on hard stones, wanting. He has a vague memory of having fought his way out of the forest in a blind panic, a nightmare of shadow and blurred green branches lashing his face. He rises shakily and walks to the water's edge. He wades in up to his knees. The shock of cold is wonderful. It's the thing that will restore his sanity, and kneels to wash vomit from his face and shirt. Then a wave knocks him over so that by the time he stands, he's choking on seawater and soaked through and through. He's alone on the beach now, but he sees movement among the buildings of Kate in the middle distance. The priest disappearing into the white church on the hill. Part 1, Remittance, 1912, Chapter 10. When Edwin reaches the church, the door is ajar, and the room is empty. The door behind the altar is open too, and through it he sees a few gravestones in the green quiet of the tiny cemetery. He slips into the last row of pews, closes his eyes, and rests his head in his hands. The building is so new that the church still holds the fragrance of freshly cut wood. "Did you fall in the ocean?" The voice is gentle, the accent still indecipherable. The new priest Roberts, he remembers, stands at the end of his pew. "I knelt in the water to wash vomit from my face. Are you unwell?" "No, it seems silly now and a little unreal. I thought I saw something in the forest. After I saw you, I heard something I don't know. It seemed supernatural." The details are already slipping away from him. He walked into the forest, and then what he remembers: darkness, notes of music, a sound he couldn't identify, all of it over in a heartbeat. "Did it really happen?" "May I sit with you?" "Of course." The priest sits beside him. Would it help to unburden yourself? I'm not Catholic. I'm here to serve everyone who walks through those doors, but the details are already fading. In the moment, the strangeness Edwin encountered in the forest was utterly destabilizing, but now he finds himself thinking of a particularly bad morning at school. He was 9, maybe 10, and he realized that he couldn't read the words in front of him because the letters were wriggling into incoherence, and there were spots swimming in his vision. He stood from his desk to ask to go see matron, and he fainted. Fainting was darkness, but also sound, a murmuring and chirping like a chorus of birds, a blank void followed rapidly by an impression of being comfortably at home in bed, wishful thinking on the part of his subconscious presumably, and then he woke into utter silence. Sound returned gradually like someone turning a dial, silence fading into clamor and racket, the exclamations of other boys and the rapid steps of the approaching teacher. Stand up street. Andrew, no more malingering, and was the moment just now. In the forest really so different? There were sounds, he reasons, and darkness just like in that first instance. Perhaps he just fainted. I thought I saw something, Edwin says slowly, but as I say it I realize that perhaps I didn't. If you did, Robert says gently, you wouldn't be the first. What do you mean? It's just I've heard stories, the priest says. That is, one hears stories. This clumsy amendment strikes Edwin as a kind of camouflage. Robert's changing his patterns of speech to sound more English, more like Edwin. There's a wrongness about the man that Edwin can't entirely pinpoint. If I may ask, Father, where are you from? Far away, the priest says. Very far away. Well, that's all of us, isn't it? Edwin says a little irritably. Excepting the natives, of course. When we met in the forest just now, you said you were filling in for Father Pike, didn't you? His sister was taken sick. He left last night. Edwin nods, but there's something about this that rings utterly false. Or that I didn't hear anything about a boat going out last night, though. I have a confession to make, Robert says. I'm listening. When I saw you in the forest, and I said I was going back to the church, well, I turned back for just a moment as I was walking away. Edwin stares at him. What did you see? I saw you walk under a maple tree. You were looking up into the branches of the tree, and then, well, I had the impression that you could see something I couldn't. Was there something there I saw? Well, I thought I saw, but Roberts is watching him too intensely, and in the quiet of this one-room church at the far edge of the Western world, Edwin is oddly spooked. He's still a little ill. He has a pounding headache and colossally weary. He doesn't want to talk anymore. He wants only to lie down. Robert's presence here doesn't make sense to him. If Pike left last night, Edwin says, he must have swum, but he did leave. Roberts says, I assure you. Do you know how starved this place is for news, Father? Really, any news whatsoever? I live in the boarding house. If a boat had gone out last night, I would have heard about it at breakfast. The obvious next thought occurs to him. Speaking of things I should have heard about, how did you get here? No boats arrived in the past day or two, so am I to assume you strolled in through the forest? Well, Robert says, I'm not sure how my mode of transportation is strictly relevant. Edwin rises, which forces Roberts to rise too. The priest backs into the aisle, and Edwin brushes past him. Edwin, Roberts says, but Edwin's already at the door. Another priest is approaching, climbing the stairs that lead up from the road. Father Pike, just returning from a visit to the cannery or the logging camp, his shock of white hair all but shining in the sunlight. Edwin looks over his shoulder into an empty church with its back door hanging open. Roberts has fled.